Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you very much for joining me today. Well, when we first started the podcast, we recorded a couple of podcasts on what to expect during an assessment for a brand new ISO standard. And we've used that podcast as a point of reference so many times as a consultancy firm. It's been a really great, useful resource for a lot of companies that are embarking on an assessment for the very first time. But what we haven't covered yet is what to expect on an ongoing basis. So there's something called an annual surveillance audit, which I know sounds awful. I'm not that keen on the terminology used, but a surveillance audit is something that certification bodies do on an annual basis. So once you achieve certification to an ISO standard, it's valid for 3 years. And once you've completed the assessment, you can't take your foot off the gas. It's not like, oh, thank you very much for the certificate, see you in 3 years. There is an annual process to evaluate that the work that you're doing continues to meet the requirements of the standard. And that's ultimately where the credibility and confidence kicks in when it comes to certification. It's not you just basically having a certificate. Yes, that is the cherry on the cake. It is definitely an advantage from a sales and marketing perspective, but that isn't what's going to help you to elevate your business and to raise your standards. Your management system will do that for you. That's if it's based on continual improvement. So I see these annual surveillance visits as a real opportunity to demonstrate how you're continually improving your business, as well as meeting the standards, of course. So I'm actually going to record this podcast as a 2-part series, because when I first started looking at what to expect during an annual surveillance visit, actually there's more work involved with the preparation than there is in the actual surveillance visit itself. So that's why I'm going to split it in two. Okay. Now, there isn't any right or wrong way to prepare for an annual surveillance visit. And of course, it will be dependent on the resources that you've got internally within your business and the standard and the number of standards as well. So you might have a combined annual surveillance visit where obviously there's more work involved in that particular scenario. But the hints and tips that I'm going to give you is basically going to be beneficial for any organisation that will be embarking on their very first annual surveillance visit. And for those of you that have already undertaken a few surveillance visits, it could be actually used as a bit of a checklist of good practice on what to do to prepare for your next annual surveillance visit. Okay, so when you get that date for your annual surveillance visit, the first thing that you need to do is check that you've actually got a copy of the agenda for the visit. Now, ordinarily, most certification bodies will have a copy of your agenda for the surveillance visit at the end of your last report. So if your last report was actually an assessment report, your stage 2 assessment report, it should be at the end of that assessment report. So if you have recently had a surveillance visit, then the agenda for the next visit should again be on that last report. So I hope that makes sense. Now, most, as I say, ordinarily, most certification bodies do that. Some don't. So it's always in your best interest and your colleagues' best interest to get a copy of that agenda as soon as possible. So the way that it generally works, once you're certified, is that the certification body will be coming in on an annual basis over the next 3 years. So year 1 surveillance, year 2 surveillance, year 3 is a surveillance, but it's also classed as a recertification visit. So it's not as thorough as your original assessment. It's more similar to a surveillance visit that you have on an annual basis. Some certification bodies will add more time and it'll be a bit more thorough. Some certification bodies will have something called a strategic review, where they're looking back at the previous 3 years and then looking ahead and planning for the next 3 years. Now, regardless of which certification body it is, there will be a plan for the 3-year duration that you're certified for. And quite often there will be a 3-year plan on what they're actually going to audit you. So it's not like an assessor is just going to rock up on a day without an agenda. That agenda should be planned well in advance. And again, it's in your interest to have a copy of that agenda to make sure that you're fully prepared for the topics that assessor is going to be covered. Now, I'm calling them an assessor. Some certification bodies will call them a client manager. But ultimately, it's a representative from your certification body. And as I have mentioned in previous podcasts, we would only recommend going with an accredited certification body. So if you're in the UK, the one and only accreditation body is UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So they will stipulate that there is a 3-year programme. Okay, so going back to the preparations then. So number 1 is get a copy of that agenda. I'd also look at confirming locations. So if you've got multiple locations, you need to know exactly where your assessor is going to be going. Okay, is it just the one location for the one day? Or if you've got a surveillance visit over 6 days, which locations are they going to be at? Because you need to be able to inform your colleagues of the agenda, so the items that are going to be covered, and also the locations of those visits as well. So once you've done that, you'll be able to then brief employees within the company of that visit. And to save everybody's time, you'll be able to schedule any specific timings for any key personnel. So let's say an assessor is going to be covering training and competency, okay, which comes up in a number of ISO standards. That could be the responsibility of a HR manager, and you will want to ensure that the HR manager is available on that day and at a particular time as well. So yes, you can give them a rough idea on times, but more often than not, it's better if you've got specific times, because that means that that manager can be dedicated. They are 100% committed to that visit from the assessor for that particular time, and they are completely devoted to giving the assessor all the information that they need during that period of time. The other benefit, of course, is that they are then free to do their job for the rest of the day. Okay, so they're not hanging around all day wondering when the assessor's going to see them. So it just helps in terms of communication and organisation if you can get those key people lined up on the specific days and specific times as well. So you might want to book meeting rooms ahead if you do have them. Now, the assessors sometimes are quite happy for the auditee to actually come into the meeting room and share information. Now, most companies will have all of that information available online, so you may be in a meeting room for the day with access to your service systems records so that the assessor can easily see them on a screen in that one meeting room. However, that may not be possible to get access to that information in that meeting room. So the assessor is likely to go around and have a look and shadow people basically to see what they're doing for them to explain that particular activity. So you need to be prepared for the assessor actually having a walk around. More often than not they do, especially when it comes to things like health and safety standards, information security, because of course that covers physical security. Health and safety and environmental are the main ones really. So once they've done that floor walk, again, having that meeting room available is going to be useful. So I would probably recommend booking out the meeting room for the day, just in case, because it's useful for the assessor to have an opening meeting. Now, I'll be recording a separate podcast on what to expect on the day. This is just preparation in advance. So typically that meeting room would be available for the opening meeting, which would be the assessor, yourself if you're the ISO management system representative, and any other key people that you think would be relevant for that opening meeting. And they may also come back into that room if it's a closing meeting. Now obviously we're talking about this being a physical visit, and pre-COVID they're all physical visits. There may be a hybrid of remote visits and physical visits. So again, when I mentioned about looking at the location, will they be coming on site or will it be a remote visit? Now, since coming out of lockdown, most certification bodies' preference is to go on site. Okay, so you need to be prepared for either of those. And you may actually influence that decision as well, again, depending on the standard. So the next point is to check that you've got all of the relevant management system records in place and that they're up to date. Okay, now, in theory, you should be doing this on an ongoing basis. You shouldn't be doing what we used to call a Blue Peter job where, here's one I created earlier. If you're managing your management system in the way that it should be managed, it shouldn't be a mad dash to pull together this information. You should already have access to that information at your fingertips. So that could be details of your non-conformities and the evidence that they've been closed out. It could be internal audit reports. They've all been completed and your internal audit schedule or programme is up to date. You've also got access to your management review minutes. Okay, so these are all the typical sorts of things that an assessor would expect to see when they come in. Okay, and again, this would be referenced on your agenda. It's very likely that internal audits will be on there, management review will be on there, things like document control. So the key components of an ISO management system are generally always audited at every visit. But they will then select other aspects of your management system to audit periodically. So year one, it could be HR, finance. Year two, it could be focusing on operations or purchasing, supply chain, customer feedback. So it will vary from year to year, which again, that's why that agenda is so important. Now at this point, I would like to just remind our listeners that we've got the ISology Hub, which is our online one-stop shop portal for all things ISO. And within that, we do have ISO Standards Handbook. So let's say you're certified to ISO 14001. We've got an ISO 14001 handbook. And that details all the things that you should be doing once you're certified on either a day-to-day, week-by-week, month-by-month basis. Okay, so that's guidance and support. So you haven't got a big shock when it comes to the annual surveillance visit because you've actually been practicing all the key activities that you should have been doing throughout the year. So be prepared, make sure that all of your records are up to date. The next thing I would do is just check that you've actually closed out any opportunities for improvement or non-conformities from your last surveillance audit. Now, if you haven't had a surveillance audit yet, you will be looking at your last certification body report, which is likely to be your stage 2 report. Okay, so there may have been some findings within your report, whether it's a surveillance audit report or a stage 2 audit report, where the assessors actually identified some OFI, some opportunities for improvement, or even maybe a minor non-conformity. Now, it's always worthwhile looking at that last report to double check that the action has actually been taken and that you've reviewed it and to see whether it's been effective or not. Because that's actually going to be one of the first things that an assessor will be looking to address. Okay, so if they've already identified that there are certain records that were missing, then they will be coming back to make sure that they are in place now. So have a look at your last report, whether it's a surveillance audit report or a stage 2 assessment report, and make sure that any of those findings have been actioned and closed out. Another thing I'd recommend is just checking if there have been any changes within your business that may affect the scope of certification. Again, this is a question that will always crop up in the opening meeting with your assessor, regardless of the certification body. They're interested to see what's happening within the business, if there have been any changes that could potentially affect the certification. So they could be things like, you've extended services, you've got new products and services, that may not have any controls in place yet in relation to your management system that you may wish to include within the scope of certification. You may have new sites. Okay, so if you've got different locations, again, you need to think in advance of your surveillance visit. Would we like those new sites included within the scope of certification? So you might have people working for you remotely overseas, which is absolutely fine. You need to decide whether you'd like to include them within your scope of certification. And the fact, it'll be down to a leadership decision because it will be based on whether you'd like that included on the certificate and also from a financial and operational perspective as well. So it's worthwhile checking with leadership if there are likely to be any changes at all that could affect this forthcoming surveillance visit that you've got coming up. And then finally, just on the last 2 points really I'd like to make, these are generally done within a few days of your surveillance visit. I just confirm the assessor's attendance. Is it the assessor that you're expecting? And just double check if they've got any accessibility or dietary needs that you need to be aware of, so that you can then inform any other people within your company, which could be security or reception, to advise them that you have got a visitor who will be attending because they might need a visitor pass when they arrive. And also, obviously, if it's a standard like the information security standard, that's going to be one of the first things that the assessor will be assessing you on before they even meet you. So they'll be checking, okay, so have I got to sign into a visitor's book? Am I getting a visitor's badge? So they'll be assessing you before they even meet you on that surveillance visit. So just a little word of warning. It's always good to be prepared and to make sure that that assessor will be welcomed in accordance with your company policies and procedures. It's also worthwhile, again, if you're looking at arranging a lunch, you don't have to provide a lunch. Sometimes an assessor will bring their own lunch. In the past, I've taken assessors out for lunch when I was a quality manager many years ago. Or you may decide to have lunch in, and have some other members of the company join you. That's entirely up to you. Again, there's no right or wrong way. But again, just make sure that you're prepared for that and that there is a break that's been allocated, which in theory should already be on the agenda. So I would also send an email out just to remind employees about the surveillance visit. So you may have done this a month or so in advance to make sure that everything is in place that should be in place. But obviously everybody's very busy. It's worthwhile just sending out an email, maybe a day or two beforehand, just to advise them that the assessor will be coming. Now, I personally think it's good to keep everybody on their toes because at the end of the day, the management system is everybody's responsibility. So if you've got an environmental management system, it's not just one person that's responsible for that. It's everybody's duty to act responsibly when it comes to your environmental management system, which could be as simple as turning lights off, making sure that they're putting waste in the right waste bins and doing things that your company has established as your own way of working as far as environmental management is concerned. So at the end of the day, an assessor could ask anybody any questions. So I think that they need to be prepared for that. Although, again, according to the agenda, he will be covering or she will be covering specific items in a specific order, and ideally we need to have a process owner available to meet with them to explain about those processes and show any evidence, of course. But yeah, I just thought I'd mention that it's good to keep everybody on their toes because in theory, anybody could be asked a question. Assessor could be walking a corridor and say, hi, just wondered if you're aware of your environmental policy. And they might look at them and think, but what's that? But if it's been on display in a common work area, or if it's been communicated via the management system, then in theory, they should be able to say, yeah, we have got an environmental policy, and would you like me to show it to you? Or, you might get lucky there, actually, if they do say that. But they should be aware of the fact that you've actually got one. Okay, they don't need to be an expert on it by any means, but they do need to be aware of these things. So, last but not least, before the actual assessor walks through the door, I would always do a floor walk. Okay, so obviously if you're doing a remote audit, this isn't applicable, but again, and you're looking for specific things with specific standards. So if it's information security, you want to ensure that all of your controls that you've got in place are being met from a physical security perspective. So if you've got key fobs, you're making sure that that's all working effectively. If you've got confidential waste bins, that they are actually being used, and you haven't got confidential waste just sitting around on a printer or just on somebody's desk. You haven't got passwords on post-it notes stuck on a monitor, and that you're practicing what you preach. Okay, so it's always good just to have a quick walk around, because at the end of the day, you'll be doing a bit of a recce in terms of being the eyes and ears from an information security perspective, and just kind of put yourself in the assessor's shoes on that morning, okay, or the day before. Similarly with environmental management, are people putting waste in the right waste bins? Are people recycling? Again, it's just making sure that you are meeting the standards that you've set for your organisation from a physical perspective. So in terms of preparation, hopefully those tips will guide you on your next surveillance visit, just to give you a bit of a heads up really with what to expect. So the next episode, I'll be talking about what to expect during that surveillance visit. So I'll be providing a few more hints and tips on what that looks like, just to give you a bit of a heads up. So before I go though, I'd just like to mention that we actually offer this service in terms of being on site during your annual surveillance visit through our ISO support plan. So we've got in excess of over 100 clients that we provide this service for, and we act as their ambassador, and we support their leadership team in guiding the assessors through the surveillance visit. Now, it's not our management system. We're literally there to coordinate activities both in advance and during that surveillance visit, so that the assessors are speaking to the right people at the right time, and that all the employees have been briefed effectively so they know what to expect. And it's really just to make sure that that day goes as smoothly as possible, both for our clients, for the company, and also for the assessor as well, so that we can have a very productive and hopefully enjoyable day. So that's all from me. I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to achieve certification to an ISO standard, or just need a helping hand with ISO compliance? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com